Good evening and welcome to all of you. We have arrived at the last session of the 52nd week of the Tatini Institute. The first week, and we hope all the last week carried out entirely online with Imprato present, I believe, just only the representatives of the city institutions and the extraordinary staff members and the secretariat who have made, I would say, a good, magnificent contribution to the good running of this experience, despite these still difficult times. Without a doubt, we want to be able to return to Prato, I think, as soon as possible. They were equally today's very rich in content, intense, carried out in a warm atmosphere, and lively and active scientific discussion, or ways of friendly, I must say, friendly collaboration and intense participations of each in the work of the other, albeit at a distance. This afternoon, we will conclude our work with the traditional round table and the final discussion. The aim of this last session is to discuss the whole of the reports presented, to focus on the main and most original results of the conference, to highlight aspects that would need to be studied more deeply, to suggest new perspectives, to push towards comparisons between historical phases, different historical phases, and different local and regional situations. It will be good to keep in mind the basic questions to which Erkertz drew our attention on Monday morning. The mutual, reciprocal, and bilateral relations between fashion and economic developments in the countries. The speaker of our roundtable are Salvatore Ciriacono, Mariana Kovalevsky, and Michael North. After their interventions, the general discussion will open. Everyone can ask to speak by writing in the chat, and before each intervention in the general discussion, everyone should introduce themselves very briefly, name, institution, possibly field of interest. I must ask that any comments or questions be clear and concise, a few minutes, no more than, I think, 5 minutes for any contribution of a more general nature. I think we can start. The first, I agree, when also Mariana Kovalevsky is agreed, we can start with Mariana Kovalevsky, connected from New York, I mean, of Fordham University, professor of history and medieval studies in Fordham University. She is the first speaker this evening for our round table. You have the floor, Marianne. Thank you very much.
So now I see why everybody, when they try to turn their PowerPoint on, they say things like, "Can you see it? Can you see it?" I can't see it. Letizia or Laura, would you tell me? I mean, I followed the directions here.
Ok, provo io.
Can you see the PowerPoint? Because I cannot see it. Let's see.
One moment.
Yes. Just we need the full screen.
Now we can see the PowerPoint.
How's that?
Good. Okay. Perfect.
Works?
Perfect. Yeah, it works.
All right, excellent. So Thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conference, and I'm Mariana Kovalevsky. I teach at Fordham University. I am a medieval historian. I'm in the Department of History and cross-appointed to the Center for Medieval Studies. So when Marco Belfonte and I proposed the Settimana theme of fashion as an economic engine 3 years ago, our main aim was to highlight how fashion could stimulate economic transformations in its own right, not only, for example, indirectly through textile manufacturers. I'm pleased to say that our expectations have been more than met in the array of excellent papers that have presented in the last 2 days. It is a source of satisfaction to see that virtually all the bullet points in the call for papers have received some attention, some more than others. In my brief comments today, I'm putting on my medievalist hat and offering a few random thoughts on the economic impact of fashion, especially in terms of continuity and change. How different were the innovations, marketing strategies, and consumer behavior in fashion in the medieval and early modern periods? As a medievalist, I am struck by how often developments characterized as new in the 17th and 18th centuries can also be identified in the 14th and 15th centuries, even though these developments may have been more intense and rapid in the later centuries. Here I'm also picking up on Professor Mozzarelli's arguments that medieval developments in fashion represented the beginning of the road to modernity. So first of all, innovation. Similarities more than differences characterize medieval and early modern innovations in the production of textiles, which all required capital investment and yielded cost reductions and improvements in quantity and quality. In both periods, knowledge transfer from immigrants who were sometimes deliberately recruited for their technical skills, we didn't hear too much about this, but it is part of the literature, could play a critical role. Most technological innovations, whether the horizontal loom, new tailoring techniques, lace making, or the use of new world dye stuffs, are imprecisely dated developments that took some time to realize fully. Other changes singled out in the early modern period, such as the shift to lighter, cheaper, and less durable textiles, to mixed fiber fabrics, and to linen underwear, all originated in the late Middle Ages. But a break in the traditional process of technological innovation did occur in the second half of the 18th century, when complementary inventions, such as the spinning jenny, water frame, and mule, can be attributed to named inventors at specific times and locations. These and other inventions, such as the cotton weaving machine, radically improved the production and quality of textiles in laying the foundation for the Industrial Revolution. There are also interesting questions to ask about the motivating factors behind these innovations across time. Convincing arguments have been made for how changing patterns of consumption stimulated technical innovations in the 18th century. But were the general contours of innovation all that different in the earlier and later centuries? There are medieval parallels to the quickening pace of adaptation and invention, to the power of choice among consumers as the variety of fabrics, colors, and shapes proliferated, and to the impact of multiple, even global forces shaping both supply and demand. Are the differences mainly those, one of degree? Perhaps this is a question that can be revisited at the next Settimana in 2022, which very conveniently is on the knowledge economy, innovation, productivity, and economic growth. Now, product innovations have also been a major theme in the conference papers, with in-depth analysis of changes in shape, weaving patterns, fiber content, and color. Although the focus has been on demand more than on supply, and rather less has been said about economic stimulants such as state fiscal policies and rising standards of living. Really, only one paper took that debate on. These non-demand factors have received considerable attention in the past, but how do we fit demand into the traditional framework that we've had? And here I keep thinking, what would John Monroe think of all of this? What role should economic historians assign consumer demand compared to supply and larger political, financial, and demographic trends in assessing what prompted innovations in the types of garments being produced? And did the balance of these factors differ in the medieval and early modern periods? And most importantly, were all product innovations also fashion innovations? Oops. 2, commercial strategies. Although the proliferation of prints, costume books, and magazines depicting fashionable dress offered more targeted marketing strategies in early modern than medieval Europe, the retailing venues of markets and shops were largely the same across the entire period. And the fairs that remained, I think, performed essentially the same functions as earlier fairs. Maybe I'm wrong, but there seems to be little new evidence about shops or other locations where cloth and clothing were offered for sale. I've been struck by the similarities in the images that speakers have used to illustrate shops, especially in terms of these kind of overhead bird's eye view of open marketplaces in the medieval and early modern periods. And when looking at these, I'm thinking it looks just like the Sunday market in the Piazza del Duomo of Prato. There is, however, perhaps more to say about changes in the experience of shopping over time, whether done by drapers, mercers, and intermediaries seeking textiles and mercery from local, regional, and international suppliers, or by consumers themselves. Did the greater variety of textile and fashion choices in the early modern period fundamentally change how consumers approach shopping for garments and dress accessories? When exactly could a fashion-forward aristocratic lady or a middling urban guildsman or a well-off peasant walk into a shop and find ready-made wear? Was that entirely outside our period? I'd like to know more. The speakers have done a great job telling us about the sellers and makers of cloth and clothing and how changes in their tasks, guilds, profits, and influence can reflect changes in the production of cloth and clothing, and therefore fashion. Indeed, the history of urban guilds has often served as a lens to track product innovations and consumer behavior in the manufacture and sale of textiles and dress. But can we step back and look at the lingerie in a European perspective? Drapers and tailors in 13th century Catalonia sound a lot like their counterparts in England at this time. But by the early 16th century, the London tailors had become the liveried company of merchant tailors, with significant investments in control of the domestic cloth trade. The purview of the tailors of the provincial English city of Exeter experienced a similar, though not so spectacular, expansion. Did the tailors of Vic undergo a similar rise? And if they did, what might that actually tell us about fashion and the economy? I've also learned that secondhand clothes dealers in medieval Bruges were really a manufacturing trade, which was not entirely the case for their counterparts in London at the time. Parisian embroiderers were organized into guilds during the Middle Ages, but even in the 18th century, the Lyon embroiderers worked as independent contractors. What are we to make of these similarities and differences? Or should we simply throw up our hands and concentrate on understanding this organization of labor in our own research bailiwicks? 3, consumer behavior. Now, consumer behavior has rightly received much attention in the Settimana papers, with convincing evidence across all periods that clothing was a crucial part of the material culture, even of middling and poorer people, representing a significant expense in their budgets and an opportunity for them to communicate both individual and collective identities. Also welcome is the attention being paid to how gender, and among women, how marital status influence patterns of dress consumption. Social emulation is everywhere perceived as a potent force of consumer choice.
Excuse me, Marianne, but we are seeing always the same image.
Oh, I'm glad you told me that.
No,
so
no,
you're
no.
saying the same slide?
Or perhaps is only my case, only for me.
Your case.
It's only your
case. Sorry, but
no problem,
it's a problem
Marianne.
for me, only for me. Thank you.
It's only for you.
Oh,
Excuse me.
All right. So could somebody, just one person, tell me, is the PowerPoint okay, or should I do something else?
Okay, but
The
not for me.
Okay.
This is a problem.
But it's okay for everybody else. That's what's important.
Excuse me.
Okay. All right. I think that's where I was. So, social emulation is everywhere perceived as a potent force in consumer choice, although we have also been given some examples of bubble-up phenomena in medieval Valencia, Renaissance Florence, and 18th century Vienna. But I also want to know more about why noble or urban elites would adopt dress practices from lower social groups. Were the reasons gendered in any way? I'm thinking here of how easily the street fashions of soldiers were adopted and wonder if masculine street fashion can be more easily adapted to elite fashion taste when it reinforces aspirational male virtues like strength, bravery, and a certain youthful insouciance. Even today, male street fashions such as jeans falling off a guy's butt to show his underwear have had an easier time making it to fashion runways than any female street fashion, which has a tendency to put an inexpensive twist on magazine high fashion. As several speakers have noted, when it came to shopping for ready-made clothing, consumers often looked to secondhand dealers. Scholars have only recently begun to rethink secondhand clothing, which medievalists, at least, have tended to view as reflecting the poverty of its buyers, whereas now the emphasis is placed on the large consumer market that secondhand dealers served. In the Middle Ages, when ready-made wear was rare, except perhaps for headgear, footgear, and dress accessories, secondhand clothes dealers were the main providers of ready-made garments. Non-elite customers could acquire colors, fur trimmings, and expertly cut garments that they would not be able to afford when new, through purchases or through gifts or through bequests of used clothing. This is a topic that deserves more attention, not only because it is likely that secondhand dealers served an even larger market in the medieval than the early modern period, but because these dealers could also fashion new clothing out of old garments, and because used clothing helped to blur the boundaries of social distinction that we see as such an essential function of dress. It was also a clothing trade that employed a lot of women. And the resale value of clothing and accessory points to their use as capital to secure loans and pay debts. Lastly, sources and new methodologies. This was the final question of the call for papers. How can economic historians draw on new methodologies and different types of sources for understanding the relationship between fashion and the economy? The papers have indeed presented a wealth of methodological approaches and clever exploitation of often recalcitrant sources in offering useful data and interpretations on this relationship. Archaeological evidence is now playing a more important role in understanding fashion, especially in the Middle Ages, when documentary sources are more scarce. For example, this is not from the Settimana, but I think it illustrates my point. A close examination of hundreds of excavated leather shoes embroidered with red and yellow silk in 12th century Norway established not only that the silk likely came from Central Asia and Byzantium, but also that this fashion trend, which lasted into the first 2 decades of the 13th century, went far down into the social hierarchy, suggesting that the silk yarn needed for the embroidery was affordable across a wide social spectrum. And we have seen that in several of the papers, historians are also now benefiting from scientific analysis of the fiber content, processing, colors, and designs of fabrics across the medieval and early modern periods to augment our understanding of changes in production techniques and consumer preferences. We have also heard how many museums are now making their textile and dress collections more easily available for consultation by scholars in person online. This screenshot is from the Museum of London's Dress and Textiles collection, which illustrates their available resources. The museum's archaeological archive is the largest in the world, and most items are discoverable via an online searchable catalog. So, for example, if I go to the medieval collection, which contains over 12,000 artifacts, I can search on the word cap for the period 1100 to 1500, and I get back 74 results. If I click on one of the images, it brings me to a catalog entry with further descriptions of the item. These types of digital resources, which have not only become accessible in the last few years, provide another value, which have only become accessible in the last few years, provide a valuable source for fashion historians to employ. Now, because consumer behavior was central to so many of the conference papers, Probate inventories and to some extent bankruptcy and shop inventories have become a particularly important source. Some regions such as Valencia seem to be blessed with especially early and full inventories, but scholars everywhere are spending more time locating and transcribing these documents because of the information they contain about material culture, including data about the value, characteristics, and customers of textiles, or I should say owners of textiles, clothing, and dress accessories. Here too, new digital sources are proving especially helpful. Some members of this audience will know about the new LII project at Harvard University, which is making medieval inventories and other lists of objects accessible as open, structured data sets that can be searched and subjected to computational analysis. They include inventories from all corners of Western Europe, including a significant set from Valencia. So clicking on one of the inventories opens up two facing windows, one with the original document and the other with a transcription, as shown here for a 1494 inventory of a Dublin merchant who happened to die in London. In addition to providing new data to dress historians, these museum and new digital resources projects have great pedagogical value in being well suited for student research projects. I mean, I have for many years used the Museum of London catalog for student digital projects. And I think that the LII project is deliberately targeted towards students as well. These projects also, in combining archaeology and documentary sources, are providing an interdisciplinary perspective in LII, for example, provides archaeological ontologies for its documentary archaeology. Another project that combines archaeological and documentary research is Living Standards and Material Culture in English Rural Households, which examines objects recovered from hundreds of archaeological excavations, along with lists of goods forfeited to the crown by criminals and by suicides. And what they want to do is, what they're doing is investigating the extent to which a consumer revolution occurred in the period from 1300 to 1600. This project is producing a monograph and essay collection, as well as transcripts of selected lists of these forfeited goods from people who are really quite far down the social ladder. There are also new online sources that offer help navigating the pitfalls of textile terminology, a problem that has come up several times in the past 2 days. The Lexis of Cloth and Clothing project, shown here, for example, offers a searchable glossary of types of cloth and garments, which are contextualized by identifying the earliest references, such as we see here in the bottom for Holland cloth. The Lexis focuses on the British Isles and Ireland and encompasses more than 15 of the languages spoken there, from Old English and Old Irish to Latin and Anglo-Norman French. But I suspect there are similar digital resources becoming available elsewhere for other regions, other languages, and for both the medieval and early modern periods. And I think here that John Stiles' suggestion that we create a shared dictionary of cloth types and their measurements suggests that there is a particular need to bring this material together in one place for those examining the international trade in textiles and fashion. I would like to close, therefore, by suggesting that we gather a list of these digital resources in the history of textiles and dress, an appendix for the Settimana volume that we produced from this conference, or better yet, that we produce a curated list on the Dattini Institute website, which is becoming an increasingly valuable scholarly resource for historical images, open access papers, ebooks, and the Dattini archive itself. Thank you very much.
Okay, my microphone. Thank you very much for this rich and very interesting contribution to the discussion, for the many questions and the methodological perspectives and the projects you have posted to our attention. Thank you very much. I think now we can try with Salvatore. I have said Salvatore Ciriacono is professor of modern history in the University of Padova, and now he has the floor.
Yeah,
Prego,
thank you.
Salvatore.
Yeah, I
Okay.
was busy with the textile history, and I was busy with water, but it was another old topic for me. Textile history, especially silk industry, in comparison with France. But about the Congress, I have to say that I enjoyed very much many papers, but I would like to stress the necessity to look at other aspects as politics, international aspects, psychology, and we cannot forget that dress is also shame, protection, but especially about fashion, desire, ornament, distinction, apparencia, which was a paper of a colleague of Castilla, and so cultural appearance, which is a very important issue, not only in the last time by Pierre Bourdieu, L'Esprit de Distinction, or Baudrillard, but also Flügel, for instance. Flügel in the 30s wrote an important articles about the problem of the extinction. There are also reports with linguistic. Jacobson is speaking about language of clothes. So language of clothes, that means, of course, distinction and social contrast, social desire, fashion as a kind of a dream, especially of the low classes. It is interesting that Muzzarelli underlined the problem of medieval history. That means fashion became important in 13th, 14th century as a a reaction also or a growing economy. In this sense, we have to stress the fact that fashion is strictly connected with the economic trend. Catherine Covesi, who is an Australian, thinks that the luxury was very important only in 16th century. So she is postponed this trend, not 13th, 14th century, but just with a Renaissance. So in any case, technical innovation was really underlined by Laurel and Wilson. So it seems that in medieval centuries, this problem of fashion became very important and perhaps very new. It's also the approach of Carlo Benfanti about that. Another issue in this Congress, very rich, I have to say, is international aspects and also materialities. So this problem of material innovation, technical innovation was stressed by John Stiles. And he's underlined the problem of different kind of innovation. So in this sense, he was going more further than cotton. He's seen many aspects of textile and material. So the industrial technical innovation connected with the price of raw material. In this sense, John Stiles is bring us in the central topic of industrial revolution, because his thesis is that the raw material became more expensive because there was a high demand. That is a social aspect, of course. And in this sense, we have to look also at this rapport with the politics and the general history. We have to see also industrial revolution also in this perspective. And in this sense, we cannot forget that England was an empire economy. She could draw cotton not only from India, Eastern India, but also before, as I remember an article of those styles, also in West Indies. There was just this arrival of West Indies. So different kind of cotton about what John Stiles stressed a lot, I have to say. But in this sense, we have to look also economic growing in different parts of the world. For instance, I was impressed by the paper of Navarro Espinach and Apanici Marti about the color of silk in Valencia. Valencia remained was very important. It was touched by many colleagues. Valencia. So why Valencia was so interested in the color of silk, and this color was really a genuine know-how. So why Valencia has also this interest for fashion, as other paper underline. So it seems that the Valencia society was a growing, more rich society. So it was also receptive about this know-how, this technique which came from Italy, especially silk. So I was also impressed by the fact that when we talk about luxury, we have not to look only to silk, which is a very rich fabric, of course. But many papers have looked at wool, hemp, cotton together. So there was a very interest about these different materials which were stressed by John Stiles. For instance, the paper of Nadia Fernandez Pinedo and also Emiliano and Maria Paz Moral, they have a look at wool, hemp, and silk together. So there was a radical change also inside the Spanish monarchy. So it was interesting that we should look at the different material in different countries. For instance, Julien Villaine of Evril, he looked at that wool in France. So there was this technique which was aimed by John Style, the wool, and not only silk. We know that the silk of Lyon was really a central point for 18th century, and there was a competition between Italy and France about luxury production, especially silk. And we know about from the papers, the work of Carlo Poni, there was a problem of fashion. The fashion came from France, from Paris and Lyon. So Julien Villaine is looking also to the wool, not only to the silk. That does not mean that silk or fashion was not important. That is remembered to us from the paper of Ballesteros de Moira Dato, who were seeing to waistcoat, which were very fashionable in Lyon in 18th century. So I think this result of this Congress is really to see the different material in different countries in different way, but we have not to forget that growing economy or the central state is playing an important role. For instance, about the role of the state is just remembered to us from the paper of Claes Nyberg in Sweden. So we have seen that Sweden, this central state, was very keen about to provide consumption, to provide yes a growing interest on the style. So it's not so secondary aspect to see how important the state was looking at, tried to intervene. Of course, when we talk about intervention of state, we have to remember how important the laws was the law to contrast the luxury. So luxury, as a Mozzarella is remember us, luxury and sumptuary laws were really connected to the problem of consumption and fashion. We know that sumptuary laws didn't work So it was really a lost battle against consumption on luxury. So when we talk also about luxury in fashion, there was a lack on Protestant countries. There was no paper about this issue. So we have looked only to Mediterranean countries, especially Flanders and Italy, Spain, but no paper about Protestantism. Perhaps we could ask us, the Protestants were less keen about fashion. The natural answer, yes, they were less interested. So it's in this sense, this is a topic which could deserve more and more attention. Social aspects and of course competition between different social classes. The social which became always from higher classes and not the lower classes. So in this century, there is a kind of movement trickle down, is writing Carlo Belfanti, and not bubble up, where trickle down, that means there is imitation from the lower classes who were looking to the higher classes. So in early modern, in the ancient regime, that's very, very clear. The imitation is from the higher class to the lower class. And the social aspect, of course, was touched in Wien from Aris Kafantojas about the servants. The servants were looking, of course, to the higher classes, but this imitation was also interesting in the Flanders, of which Peter Stabel was really a good historian. This poor in late medieval Bruges. And how could overcome this problem of poverty in comparison with the higher classes? The answer from Peter Stabel is recycling, shabby. That means they couldn't have really, yes, the same dress as the other classes. So there was a movement of recycling shabby, if I could interpret the paper of Peter Stabel. Of course, if I didn't understand or misunderstood this topic, is a good reason to react and to say, no, I interpreted in a very wrong way. But about this fashion emulation, we have also the paper of Garcia Marcia and Almenar Fernandez, again on medieval Valencia, as Maximo Garcia about Castile, but also the paper of Crete, of Tatiana, is going in this direction. That means Crete, for me as a Venetian historian, I see Crete, of course, as a semi-periphery. But semi-periphery, that means that this Crete cannot have really this silk dress as a brocade, velour, damask, and so on. So they prepare other kind of dresses, other kind of garments, which linen, hemp, and the cotton, which was not so expensive, and the silk. But the reason is always to look to Venetian higher class, this a Venetian courtesan, which were very, very rich, to whom really the periphery was seeing. So other problem in these rich 2 days by the very rich, of course, was the tailors, studied by Figueras. The tailors, which was interesting because the tailors, as the shopkeepers or the girls, are other aspects of this complex world of fashion. So fashion is really in a very articulated way. That means there are consumer, producer, but also tailor, which play important role on shopkeepers and the guilds. About the guilds, we can open really in a large chapter how important the guilds were in economic development. There is another chapter of this problem of fashion and luxury. About luxury, I'm sorry, I have to quote my book about luxury production, which is something different, something similar to fashion. They go together, but there are also differences. And of course, when we talk about luxury and fashion, we cannot forget technicalities, economy, but also international rapports. Of course, and I think the last chapter, which I would like to remember in this moment, is the martial dress, which were studied by Elizabeth Curry from the Florentine model, the Florentine milieu, where really the martial or this aspect is very interesting in this perspective. But so by battlefield aristocracy, that remember me that there is an important divide between the painting in the Renaissance Florence, Renaissance Italy, and the painting of art in 17th century Holland, for instance. We see that in Holland, the interest in 17th century is going in another direction. Is seeing to interiors of flowers, that nature, and on the opposite, still in 17th century in Florence, there is always the attention to the nobleman and the martial fashion. So in this sense, Elizabeth Curry is just going in this direction, and to see how traditional could be the fashion in Florence, 16th century, in comparison with other civilization or other aspects. I think that I remember all our colleagues, and don't forget anyone. Of course, I hope to misunderstood their problem so they can react and they condemn me. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Salvatore Ciriacono. Thank you very much for this contribution, for these sharp comments and remarks to the papers. And now we come to Michael North. Michael North is Professor of Modern History, Allgemeine Geschichte der Neuzeit at the University of Greifswald, and I think it may be you are now in California.
Michael, everywhere.
You have the floor, please.
Okay, kannst du Bildschirm?
Ja, genau.
Anklicken.
Erst den Bildschirm anklicken. Genau, dann auf Teilen.
So I'm trying, and now, and so. Okay, I hope you hear me and can listen to me.
Yes.
Okay, that's good.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Since Marianne and Salvatore have highlighted and commented the various papers, I thought it worthwhile to make some general remarks. Some of my remarks are, of course, obvious, but I think it important to highlight some of the aspects in the context of the rich papers that reflect archival research and rich archival sources. So I just wanted you to remember the nice statement by Andre Holenstein: dress constitutes a second skin, and it's identified with its wearer and its not able to separate the dress from the wearer. So this means that dress has always been a marker of difference. We learned that the way people dressed gained new significance in periods of social differentiation, and probably those periods of social differentiation would, at least with regard to dress, coincide with periods of economic growth. Fashion was, as we learned, a crucial element of social distinction, and Salvatore has highlighted this, and of self-representation. And I would like to show you a very nice example in this respect, the example of Matthäus Schwarz. Perhaps the image on the left is familiar with you, and perhaps the name Matthäus Schwarz rings a bell as well. He was a bookkeeper or the manager of the Fugger headquarters in Augsburg. However, at the same time, he was a fashionista. He had himself portrayed more than 130 times wearing different attire. On the right, you see him as a knight. Then, of course, he changed his pants various times and was painted. And then he disguised himself as a rich nobleman. And we have another 150 of those images. And we have, of course, to ask ourselves, did his personality as a businessman trigger his fashion ideas, his self-fashioning, or would this held to other people at the same period? He's an outstanding example, and normally people would know him as a bookkeeper, as a manager of the Fuggers, but not as a fashionista. In order to reduce variety of self-fashioning and complexity, governments all over Europe reacted by issuing sumptuary laws. And this links to a couple of questions. And it has been addressed by some of the papers, but not sufficiently, I would say. Did sumptuary laws trigger change in the production of fashion? That is, I think, very important, this question. And we have, of course, to ask as well whether sumptuary laws changed spending preferences or whether people still kept their habits. Another important issue, which was only addressed by Marianne a couple of minutes ago, is the role of media in the production of fashion, for example. And we know, for example, that marketing of fashion became a successful business, especially in the 17th and the 18th century, especially with the so-called fashion journals. They had a global readership, an international readership, international distribution. Subscriptions were, of course, paying for them, and they were consumed not only by people all over Europe, but they were distributed via lending libraries, reading societies. And for example, the most famous one, the Journal des Dames, which was produced in Paris, reached 39 French and 41 foreign cities in the 1760s, from Cadiz in Spain to St. Petersburg in Russia. And there's a German equivalent, the luxury journal or Journal des Luxus und der Moden, which had a similar readership, especially in Eastern and Central and Northern Europe. According to media, we have to cope with various definitions and understandings of fashion. And a few minutes ago, Klaas Nieberg puts a question in the chat: how do we understand, or how do we define fashion? And this is quite important. And we could use the fashion journals of the 18th century, or as the Germans would do it, Zedlers Universallexikon. And according to the fashion journals and Zedlers, fashion was more generally and in its broadest meaning the manner, mode, usage, custom, genre, form, shape of pattern, but more particularly the common or usual mode of dress, furnishings, coaches, rooms, buildings, manufactures, manners of speaking and writing, compliments, ceremonies and other pomp, fasts and other modes of living. This means that the issue of consumerism, which had been addressed by John Stiles, for example, has to be taken into consideration, and we have to be much broader, and we have to put or frame fashion in the complex of cultural consumption. And this would, of course, help us to understand fashion perhaps in a new way. And perhaps in 10 years, in another Settimana, we could combine fashion with consumerism and cultural consumption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for these questions, general questions, and I think we have enough arguments to develop a good discussion. We have an hour more, 1 hour more, and I see in the chat 2 interesting messages from Klaas Nieberg and Aris Kafontagias. I ask to all to write in the chat for their questions and comments and contribution to this discussion. And I call Professor Nieberg, Klaas Nieberg, when you will pose your observation for us.
Yes, is it me?
Yes, you have it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for organizing this conference and this symposium in relation to early modern and medieval history, because I have a background as an early modern professor in economic history in Uppsala since many years, and got a position in so-called fashion studies at Stockholm University 2013. And I came to a university that had the ambition to create the field of fashion studies to a discipline. So fashion studies is nowadays, after a childhood period, an established academic discipline at Stockholm University, and we have produced 10 PhDs in fashion studies. Fashion studies is by tradition, I think, very influenced by cultural history and cultural studies. And that's very sorrowful, because I think an interplay between traditional social and economic history, also related to the social sciences, could benefit a lot to the direction of what we can call modern fashion history today, because this field so far lack from a broader understanding of the fashion industry. Fashion is, on the one hand, according to fashion studies, very much of a cultural field, but it's also an industry, sometimes labeled fashion as industry, especially in the context of some milieus in the United States. I think, according to early modern history and to some extent medieval history, which I know very little about from a professional point of view, I think Peter McNeill and Giorgio Riello's have developed that connection a lot the last decade. Peter McNeill produced what he called sources to fashion history, departing from medieval documents and onwards, in spite of his angel as a cultural historian. Giorgio Riello, as you know, is an early modernist that has done a lot on global history and fashion. And that touched upon my proposal that it's very important how to define fashion, because fashion scholars in modern history, and they are a lot of people today. I just got Veronique Boyage's latest book on the relation between Paris and New York, previously developed by Nancy Green according to the ready-to-wear industry. But that was mainly about the social history of the ready-to-wear. This book grasped upon a much wider field, how fashion, modern fashion, was spread from Paris to United States and became very important as an economic force. There is a similar development according to the Italian industry after the Second World War. I think that early modernists and medievalists can learn a lot from discussions about fashion in modern history, because it's a lot of, since the last 10 years, there has been a lot of debates and discussions about what fashion actually is. And the field also run several important journals where fashion theories belong to one of the most important. And both in Stockholm, but also Parsons, London College of Fashion, and a lot of other milieus, there are a very interesting progressing discussion where a lot of historians participate, but not as fashion scholars. They participate as historians. But I think that to meet mainly the young people dealing with definition problems and developing the field of fashion studies, we could also get interesting ideas how to interpret and go back to early modern and medieval history. And for me as an economic historian, I would relate to Mikael Nord's idea to talk about the institutional factors as central. The sumptuary laws is also emphasized by Peter McNeill and by Giorgio Riello in his latest co-edited volume with that term, I think, also in the title. And modern fashion scholars relate very much to, they have a point of departure from the classical high fashion, haute couture. And from that, a lot of definitions of different types of fashion, slow fashion, fast fashion, describing the globalization of the retailers today, like H&M and Inditex, spread all over the world, imitating both high fashion and advanced ready-to-wear. That is not principally different from what was happening in medieval and early modern time. Global history has developed a similar framework for early modern time, and I think analyzing fashion in relation to pre-modern history could benefit a lot from concepts and reflections from modern scholars. Thank you.
Thank you to you. Okay, thank you very much. The next is Haris Kafontagias.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me very much for my pronunciation of your
No problem.
And the word to you.
Thank you.
Please.
It's a question more that I had during the conference. As I was starting writing this paper, I was fixated on the term proposed by Giorgio Riello and the Oxford Handbook of Consumption, this term fashionability, to talk about fashionable clothes. And I thought of using this term for the clothes and the articles and the accessories I spoke about. But as I understood my material better and the context of my research of my paper better, I moved away from this term because, as Giorgio Riello said, it is a term in order to describe what was popular, what was exotic, what was new, what was novel at the time when there was no fashion industry, to go away from notions of fashion industry in the second half of the 20th century and move the discussion within the context of the early modern period. However, as the period of my research is the second half of the 18th and the start of the 19th century in Vienna, I saw that the context is really the creation of an industry. So I saw that there were, for example, after the Vienna Congress, we have a proliferation of tailors. They go from 1,000 tailors in the second half of the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century, to about 3,000 masters and 4,000 to 7,000 apprentices in the 1840s. That means that we have a production base on which an industry can be based on. We have the proliferation of periodicals and printed press, which was local, the fashion magazine and other such endeavors later. So we have also a means of circulation of fashionable news. And when reading the sources, I saw that there were the accompanied discourses of the German costume, etc. But there was also the economic aspect of things. There was these people, these hat makers and these tailors who paid the editors in order to be advertised in the magazines. And I also observed the struggle of the Viennese fashion to make itself, to detach itself and make itself independent of the Paris and London examples. So when presentations about the later medieval times or the 16th century talked about fashion and what was fashionable, to me, this is something very different than what I am talking about. And I think that we should have a discussion not only about modern fashion, early modern fashion, but within the early modern period. I think there's some distinction there. Of course, my research goes into what we call modernity in the 19th century, but it's still concerning material culture is still not what I would term modernity. It's still the end of the early modern period. So I think we should have a discussion about how it changes, how it evolves as conceptually this term fashion within the early modern period. And if we're talking about two different things, that's the only contribution I would like to make. Thank you
very much for these observations. Professor John Stiles.
Thank you. I'd like to echo my predecessors by saying thank you to the organisers for putting on a fantastic conference in a very difficult setting. Yes. And I'd like to endorse what has just been said by Klaus and Aris, that I do think we need to draw on recent work on fashion, which has blossomed on an extraordinary scale. The study of what we might call fashion studies, broadly defined, has become an enormous industry in its own right, an academic industry studying the subject. But I want to go back to what Marianne said about much of what gets talked about in the early modern period and the modern period with regard to fashion actually being already present in different forms in the Middle Ages, at least in the later Middle Ages, and like to put this whole pattern of change in Europe in a slightly bigger context. And one of the problems here, right at the beginning, is that fashion in English, the word in English, has so many different meanings. I mean, it's come to mean just clothes. The fashion industry just means clothing, really. But it also means to make something as a verb. It's just fashioning something just means making it. But equally, it means something that's new. And that's rather different to the meaning of, say, moda or mode in French and the term in other languages. So in English, the word has a kind of imperialistic tendency to just include lots and lots of things. And I think that creates a number of problems, and we need to be clear about what we're discussing. Now, I think if we look at Western Europe in relation to the rest of the world, if we take a global history perspective, which I know if Giorgio Ariello had been able to be here, he would have done. I'm struck by two things about the whole period we're studying, from certainly the high or even the early Middle Ages to the modern era. I'm struck by two things that make Europe distinctive. The first is this move, which I mentioned briefly earlier, from what we might call a two-fiber culture, linen or bast fibers as they're known, linen and hemp, and wool, sheep's wool, to a four-fiber culture, which brings in silk and brings in cotton progressively. I mean, silk's been there a long time, cotton's been there a long time, but I'm thinking about these two new fibers being domesticated in Western Europe. They're being made there, being in all sorts of forms, not just being imported, etc., etc. And I think that's a big contrast with South Asia, which is a silk and cotton culture, or East Asia, which starts off as a silk and bast fiber culture, silk and hemp and rami. And then, in a way, cotton arrives, but it arrives in a very different way to the way it does in Western Europe. It basically replaces the bast fibers and never becomes very much of a fashion fiber in the way cotton is in Western Europe. So you have very different mixes of fibers. And what's striking about Western Europe from the High Middle Ages onwards is that it's a culture with this diversity. You have material diversity, and as a number of, a lot of economists have been arguing recently, that sort of material diversity is generative of innovation and economic growth, potentially. What it certainly does is provide opportunities for a combination of commercial specialization, because each of these fibers requires very different sorts of processing, but at the same time for a kind of commercial articulation, because all these fibers are used in combination with each other, whether it's in the mixes we've talked about, where the actual textile is mixed, or in complementary pieces of clothing. I mean, no one wears just silk. No one wears just, they wear combinations. And that's the Western European manner. And that, it seems to me, is very distinctive from other parts of the world. Now, that doesn't make fashion in another sense inevitable, but I think there is another sense in which fashion in Western Europe is distinctive. Now, I'm not here going down the Brodel, McKendrick, Enlightenment, Montesquieu route, which is that, the West and the rest. The West has dynamism, the rest of the world is static. I think that's completely wrong. It's very clear that there are all sorts of changes in the things people wear in particular, But the way those changes are organized in Western Europe is distinctive and becomes, I think, more distinctive. And that's important because textiles are at the heart of this, because after all, in any period from, you know, in the second millennium of the Christian era, textile, at least until the later 19th century, textiles are the most traded manufactured good. I suspect that's true on the planet, let alone in what centers on Western Europe. Textiles are the most traded manufactured goods. So the potential for these sorts of commercial specialization and articulation are huge. But there's also this potential in Western Europe for using for fashion, which is, yes, about identifying people, also to become a way, it's materially identifying people, but it also becomes a way of materially ordering time. And so you move to a system of great change. And I think I've argued myself, drawing very heavily on Carlo Poni in his brilliant study of Lyon, where he shows that there's a move to an annual temporal cycle. And that, in other words, time is being reorganized through things, through clothing. And although that's a departure to make it a strictly temporal cycle, it's a departure which I think has to do partly with changes in French court practice, but also more broadly in the fact that time is being commercially reorganized across all sorts of sectors in the 17th century. If you think about it, where does the newspaper originate? In the 17th century. What does the newspaper do? It reorganizes political news. Well, fashion in the same way reorganizes, the identities. So I think we need to, if you like, place these developments, and it's not that the Middle Ages were the same as the 18th century, but it's that a number of things are shared, because broadly speaking, we're operating with a system which has these full fiber textiles, in other words, considerable material diversity compared with other parts of the world, and the commercial potential that offers. I stress potential, nothing's guaranteed here. And secondly, you have the potential for temporal reordering of materiality. And that clearly has a lot to do with the commercial aspects. And above all, it has to do with time and space, and how you organize the distribution and use of material things, particularly textiles, this most traded of commodities, in time and space. And that's done, obviously all that happens in other places, in China, in South Asia, but the way it's done in Europe, it seems to me, is very, very distinctive, and becomes more distinctive with developments like Poni's annual fashion in the annual fashion cycle of the late 17th century. Okay, thank you.
Thank you to you. Yes, Professor Laurel Wilson, you can speak?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I echo everyone's thanks, and particularly to the staff, and particularly to Letizia, who has been remarkably patient and helpful through all of this. John Stiles is a really hard act to follow, so this is probably going to seem pretty simple-minded by comparison, but it seems to me one of the problems with fashion studies, as we obviously know, is that no one has ever arrived at an agreed upon definition of what fashion is. And for my purposes and the purposes of this discussion, I would like to propose a very simple one, which is that I think that fashion is a commodity system in which the primary commodity is change. And that kind of gives us a through line from the Middle Ages on. And perhaps that will be of some help. I must credit Susan Crane with coming up with it initially, but I have adopted it. So thank you.
Thank you to you. I have seen Anthony Furiot. Do you want to take the floor? I have just seen a letter in the chat from Anthony Furiot, but I don't know when he wants.
Yes, I was
yes.
following
please,
the
please, Anthony.
debate. I would like to expose my thoughts about that from the medieval perspective. I think that fashion was a driver of social mobility. I think that also in the moment that emergent classes that at the end of the Middle Ages have enriched and obtained a high social level, has innovate in fashion, not only in invest also in food and in manners of speaking in general, making a frontier between this high social class and the upper classes that try to emulate because they are also enriched. Then the role of sumptuary laws try to prevent this emulation, to mark the difference between the upper and the lower classes. But even with the sumptuary laws, these new classes, these classes, these emergent classes, arrive to emulate the higher strata, and then they who are in the higher position try to innovate. Fashion is a continuous movement through à travers lequel, je veux dire, it's the upper strata try ever to mark the difference, respect to
lower class,
those that are low, but they have to innovate constantly because those that are in the low level reach them, emulating the fashion in the manners, in the speaking, in the food, and in general in the fashion. For me, even if I think that that fashion is sociocultural
Thank you very much. We have a stop from Anthony Furiot. Yes, now it was a short interruption.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Now, have you finished? Or
yes. Yes.
Thank you very much for your observation, for this proposal to connect fashion and social mobility. I think really it's possible that in Europe we are more developed the opportunities for all the social classes to play with fashion, albeit the sumptuary laws. And this explains maybe the distinctive importance of textiles. I think I would like to stress the importance of cultural attitudes in connection with the social stratification. This is peculiar, it may be fun, of European social paysage, society. This is very interesting. I don't see in the chat more demands to participate. Yes. Okay. Mariana Kovalevsky, you can speak, and obviously all the three speakers of the round table can to take again the floor and to reply. Please, Mariana.
I'm going to change the topic a little bit. So if Aris has a comment on what was said, I think he should go first.
I have a comment on temporality, what Professor Stiles said. I agree 100%. Also, temporality is very important because the fashion industry requires specific dates. For example, in Vienna, it was the 1st of May for the summer fashion, etc. What I found, and it should be taken with a huge grain of salt, but it is an interesting small observation from my sources, is that in the first period of my research in the 1760s, I find much more clothing described as winter clothing or summer clothing. And these descriptions fade away almost completely. I only have 3 such items in the next 3 periods until the 1820s, and I'm not sure if it could be said as a finding, but I believe it has to do with the perception of what was valuable. For example, winter or summer clothing as descriptions were not as valuable for potential resale, etc., in the secondary market, and that other features of clothing became much more important. And this also has to do with the change of seasonality according to fashion, I believe. It's not so much according to the season, but more to the fashion season. Thank you.
Thank you to you. I have not seen your request. Now, Mariana Kovalevsky.
Right. So I really liked John's summation of what are the differences between Western European fashion and what fashion might be like in other regions of the world. But I especially liked it because it was a wonderful way to unite the kind of late medieval through early modern periods and really into the modern period. That said, I have become more convinced in this conference that the late 18th century might belong more to the modern period than it does to the period that we normally consider in the Settimana. You know, the inventions, just the rapid pace of change, a lot of the things. But the question that I most want to answer, so I'm going to pose it because I posed it in my comment, but no one has stepped forward, and that is the issue of ready-made wear. When did shopping as we know it today, where a wide variety of people of different social classes and different genders can walk into a shop and buy an item of clothing? I know that they can, in the Middle Ages and early modern period, go to an open marketplace. We've seen the images of that, but they're probably largely recycled clothing at that point. It doesn't look like it's new clothing. We have had very few papers on the 17th century, which I think I see now as a bit of a problem, because we had a cluster of papers on the early period, then we jumped to the late 18th century for the most part. And there's a huge swath of time in between. And it may be that a lot of these developments were slowly occurring in that period. But if the people who are working on the late 18th century can at least tell me, could you walk into a shop? I mean, I was carefully looking at pictures of shops and marketing situations and everybody. And it still seemed that people were going into shops to buy textiles. And then they would have a tailor who would make what they wanted. But of course, a lot of the pictures are for the elite. And it may well be that ready-made wear developed earlier for middling consumers. So I'm throwing the floor open. I would really like to know. Maybe Peter Stabel knows the answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you to you. I see Peter Stabel, and afterwards I've seen again. So.
Yeah, sorry, I put a kind of joke in the chat, so and putting a date, the 1st of January 1450. But I think this is a long transition, of course, which takes place in Flanders, but the temporalities can be different in other regions in the course of the 15th, early 16th century, when tailors, and we see that in the guild statutes, for example, when tailors and all other kinds of fashion industries, so the makers or manufacturers of sleeves, of gloves, and all this kind of thing, start to sell in greater quantities, and not only for export, what they call in Dutch koopwerk, which is finished commodities which are intended to be sold and therefore are made by the manufacturer and put on display in their shop, both at the market but also in their shops, in their actual shops. And for example, in Bruges in the 1440s, 1450s, we see growing tension in guilds, among guild officials and also among city officials, that they have to force their guild members to go to the markets on particular market days, because some of the guild masters prefer to sell from their shops. This is usually linked to that kind of koopwerk, to the merchandise which is finished. And so tailors in this period clearly do not only make clothes on command, on commission, when people bring their fabrics with them and ask a particular tailor to make a dress, but they buy the fabrics themselves, make the dress themselves, and put them on display in their shop windows. And that happens already in the 15th century, and it will continue and reinforce itself in the course of the 16th century. So we have to look much, much earlier than the traditional late 17th, 18th century shop displays.
Thank you. John Stiles?
I can only speak for England, and I'm sure these things happen earlier elsewhere, but to me there's three key stages. One is accessories, which come much earlier than main garments. And I think some of the most interesting accessories which begin to be sold as ready-made, certainly in the 16th century, are knitwear, knitted caps, knitting stockings, because of course they're quite hard to make as piece goods and then construct into the piece of clothing. They're knitted as the piece of clothing in the main. I mean, they will be sewn up at the back, but they're basically, the knitting process involves creating the ready-made good by definition. So I think knitwear is really important there for accessories. In England, it's pretty clear that it's in the 17th century that you move to ready-made garments, that it seems to have a lot to do with military commissioning during the Civil War. Although one of the complications of military uniforms and ready-made is that in the English army or the British army in the late 17th and 18th centuries, actually what they make is a kind of roughing up of the coat or the breeches, and each regiment has regimental tailors who are soldiers whose job is to fit the uniform to each individual soldier, and also to fight when there's a war. But their first duty is regimental tailoring. So as Peter's saying, it's a gradual process. But then there's a third stage, which I think we shouldn't forget about, which is the availability in England, anyway, and I suspect this is true in America, the availability of fabrics, of a big range of fabrics in retail outlets in English towns that allow you to have a suit or a dress commissioned really only disappears in the 1960s. And I noticed this in Paris because it happened later in Paris. But if you go to the Marais, if you went to the Marais in the 1970s or to parts of Montmartre, there are an enormous number of shops selling a huge range of textiles, and those no longer exist. So in a sense, the process of this move to ready-made extended from the late Middle Ages until the middle of the 20th century. And I think, as Peter said, it's a very, very long drawn out process. Thank you.
Well, thank you to you. Now, Claes Nyberg, and again, afterwards, Michael North.
Thank you very much. Just a few notes. I'm researching ready-to-wear right now, so I'm quite familiar with it. The genesis of it, we discussed it together with the authors of the Lyon waistcoats. I think, in a brief sense, there are differences between guild-dominated areas and areas that very early accessed a free market situation, like the Low Countries and England, where guilds continued to be strong. Tailors very often obsessed. Merchants tried to start up ready-to-wear in a lot of historical situations, and only as far as I know most about the Northern Europe and German context, it's very often cited that the Jew merchants got in Brandenburg privileges to sell new ready-to-wear. It was allowed to in many countries and regions to sell second-hand ready-to-wear. But it's important, as several of you suggest, that it's a difference between occasional ready-to-wear or artifacts and the so-called completed ready-to-wear with ready sizes. That seemed to be an early 19th century phenomenon. And in Sweden, that was quite late in all of any kind of development. It was permitted to sell ready-to-wear in a state ordinance 1834. And then we can see in especially the newspapers advertisements that it's a kind of explosion of announced ready-to-wear relating to terms that we can see in fashion magazines. So it's definitely an institutional aspect in this type of countries. And the tailors did have a very strong position to begin with, as far as we know from documents. Especially in Stockholm, there were a lot of court issues, so we know in a very big detail how they argued in courts, etc. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the whole truth, because a lot of scholars nowadays in textiles and gender history unpack hidden female work, like Mary Crowstone in the book about the Paris seamstresses, similar types of studies. It's very difficult to prove, but you have a need to develop a very delicate methodology to really find that. But it seemed to have been the case also in Sweden, according to the textile dress historian Pernilla Rasmussen. She has not published yet so much about it, but it's obvious that a ready-to-wear development in limited parts of the female dress, the most easy to sew parts, progressed in a ready-to-wear direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, now Michael North.
Yeah, I got a kind of answer to Aris' question about the fashion cycles. You have to go through letters, for example, or you have to go through fashion journals, and then you get some hints and some evidence. For example, I came across about, the British Caribbean, and especially in Jamaica, where the ladies were complaining in the 18th century, or late 18th century, that they are receiving the British winter fashions, the London winter fashions next spring, and then they had to wear them because they were the most fashionable attire, but they were sweating like mad. And so that's one of those issues. Interestingly, the journals, the luxury journals or the fashion journals provide more evidence. And for example, with respect to Vienna, Vienna was very, French-oriented, especially, as you know, thanks to the noble ladies and the noble culture. And so other fashion journals were mocking the Vienna ladies because they were eager to get the outdated fashion from Paris, while in northern Germany, in Hamburg, for example, people would prefer the newest English fashions and newest English attire. And so if you go through those journals, of course, there's a lot of gossip involved, but it shows that those fashion cycles were and fashion temporalities work highly different in various areas.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment.
Okay. Salvatore Ciriacono.
Yes, I wanted to answer or try to answer to Laura Wilson when she's saying what is fashion? Fashion is change. So if you look to change, we really have to look at psychology. That means this idea to change something which is not more necessary. So it is really, so richer is a society, more rapid is the fashion. We have to change. So for instance, a raincoat is already old-fashioned. A raincoat. We have to have a short coat because on the opposite we are an old man. That there is a connection which we cannot avoid between economy and psychological aspects. So the man is really inside society. The society is really writing the law, and we have to follow this law. So when I was young, I think that two trousers were sufficient, and now the young people they have to have just a broken trousers. On the opposite, they don't follow the fashion. So there is a bubble up, which is called a bubble up. So the young people don't follow the fashion of the other people. So that's in this sense, fashion or change go together with economy, but also the richness of society.
Okay, thanks. I have seen the hand of Hannelore Pepke. Is here Hannelore Pepke?
I have seen also Eric Haas before.
Before?
Eric,
Yes, I have not seen.
Eric Haas, yeah.
Yes, okay. No, I don't know. Okay, I see now Massimo Garcia Fernandez.
I am sorry.
Okay. Okay, no problem. Now I don't know. I see no other interventions in the chat. It may be we are in time to declare the discussion is over. Okay. Thanks to all the attendees, and before saying goodbye, however, I would like to invite the chairman of the scientific committee to speak for a final assessment and some concluding remarks and words. I therefore leave the ask of closing of our conference to Professor Eric Hertz. Good evening, everyone, from me, and And word to you, Eric. You have the floor. Are you here with us? Are you?
I'm here among you, very much alive and kicking.
Excuse me.
There's no problem, Giuseppe. Thank you so much for giving me the floor for just a final word. I believe that we should end this settimana as we started it, with a few words of gratitude. I thank once again the ladies of the staff of the Latini administration, Federica, Laura and Letizia, who for the first time had to organize a digital event on such a large scale. Yeah, and I guess you can easily agree with me that they all did a wonderful job. So the least I can ask from you is a very loud applause for those three ladies. I also would like to thank my fellow members in the executive committee of the Latini administration who acted as chairpersons in the different sessions. I would like to thank the participants to the round table as well, and of course also the speakers. I think I'm expressing a general feeling when saying that we had three kinds of papers during this conference. We had interesting papers, we had very interesting papers, and we had extremely interesting papers. And as several participants to the round table have noted, we heard a lot of new and original ideas on the complex relationship between fashion and the economy. We became familiar with new sources or with a fresh approach to old sources. And of course, I sincerely thank all of you who were willing to attend this meeting and were prepared to listen to all the lectures on a small screen from your work office, your living room, and even your kitchen, or in the case of Professor Stiles, probably from a deep underground nuclear bunker. Looking back on those 3 days, I deplore only one thing, that we were not able to taste the wonderful atmosphere of lovely Prato or enjoy the warm hospitality of the completely renovated textile museum, the local Museo dei Tessuti. I therefore hope we will meet again someday, and not on a small screen, but in person in one of the many restaurants or bars of Prato. And normally I should now wish all of you a safe trip back home. But I believe in these circumstances there is no need for such wishes. Except, of course, for those who after 2 or 3 days of splendid isolation have developed a very bad relationship with their partner, dog or cat. So take care of yourself. Thank you so much for your cooperation, your assistance, your help and your kindness, and bye-bye.
Dag Eric.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao Eric. Arrivederci a tutti. Bye.
Bye.